world. If you're a long-time subscriber, you probably know I'm Canadian. In case you didn't know, French is mandatory in schools here because it's one of our official languages. Unfortunately, after being out of school for some time, I've forgotten so much of my once decent French vocabulary. This was honestly a bit of a bummer given how much time and effort it took to learn French, and as you might imagine, not at all helpful in a country where a good chunk of the population is French speaking. This is why I was super excited to work with Babbel when they reached out. Babbel's lessons are all designed by real language teachers, so the lessons have you go through several ways to learn the same concept, like matching words with definitions, spelling words out, using the correct grammar, and even practicing the pronunciation, like this.
Faire de la plongée.
Faire de la plongée. So not only does Babbel speed up the learning process and enable you to have real-world conversations, but it's actually a fun way to learn, which makes it that much easier to go through the lessons. And even better, when I'm on the go, I can do all of the lessons conveniently from the Babbel app on my phone. So, with the holidays coming up, if you've got someone who's hard to buy for, Babbel might be the perfect gift. Or you could even gift yourself a Babbel subscription, because right now, Babbel is offering 60% off a subscription, and this comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. So there's no risk in giving it a try, with the link in the description below. On June 29th, 1968, Shek and Edward Exley pulled into the parking lot of one of their favorite swimming spots. It was another of Florida's many hot summer days, and Wakulla Springs, located at 14 miles south of Tallahassee, was always a good place to get some relief. The Exley brothers weren't just your average teenagers looking to cool off with a swim, though. At only 19, Shek was starting to become known around dive shops in the area as a bit of a phenom. The local dive community even talked about him like he was some sort of myth, with claims that he could extend the life of an air tank longer than any human on Earth, or that he could leisurely descend to depths that the average diver would pass out at. Hearing divers talk about Shek was like listening to a fisherman telling the story of his biggest catch, only each time he tells it, the fight gets a little tougher and the fish gets a little bigger. And the two brothers' trips to Wakulla Springs probably played a bit of a role in building his reputation at such a young age. There are signs in the parking lot of Wakulla Springs that warn that scuba diving is strictly prohibited, so this is where the brothers began to free dive instead and test their limits. During their swim, the brothers would take them to see how deep they could get to a single breath before the new air forced them to rocket back to the surface. That day, though, Shek had a new piece of equipment he would test that was competitions with his brother, not of official measurements. After they eased into the warm water of Wakulla Springs, Shek and Edward swam upstream to deeper areas. One of them would then dive down with the depth gauge and return to the surface before handing the gauge off to the other. Shek always let Edward go first, and each time his brother returned to the surface, Shek would take the gauge and go just a little bit deeper. When Edward logged 42 feet, Shek came back with a reading of 50 feet. But, determined to finally get the better of his older brother, Edward took several deep, fast breaths before filling his lungs to capacity and slipping into the water. At the surface, Shek watched as Edward descended and knew immediately when he passed his previous mark. Shek estimated that Edward went further than either of them had ever been without scuba gear, and Shek was ready to congratulate him when he broke the surface. But then when Edward turned to torpedo himself back to the surface, Shek watched as he suddenly went limp and slowly dropped to the bottom. Shek immediately descended to try to reach his brother, but Edward was unconscious and he kept falling deeper and deeper. So despite his best efforts, there was no way Shek was going to be able to reach him without scuba gear. So instead, he swam as fast as he could to the beach, hurried out of the water, and then ran to his car to grab an air tank he had in his trunk. But then as he was doing this, his body gave out on him. He collapsed from exhaustion after a single breath. There was a fellow swimmer nearby who grabbed Shek's dive gear and entered the water to rescue him. The man descended and found Edward's limp body in the bottom of Wakulla Springs. There was still a chance he could be saved, even if it was small. After the diver pulled Edward to the surface and got him onto the beach, Shek started CPR in front of a gathering crowd. By then, Edward had already been at the bottom far longer than most could survive, but miraculously, Shek managed to get him breathing again. At that point, an ambulance was on scene and rushed him to the nearest hospital, where he was placed on life support. Tragically, though, he was taken off of it later that night when it became clear that he had no brain activity. This was beyond devastating for Shek. And so from that moment, he dedicated his life to establishing diving safety standards and protocols as a way to deal with his grief and ensure that neither his parents nor the parents of any other diver would ever have to suffer that kind of pain again.
Wir reisen durch die Zeit und entdecken magische Orte. Fantastische Tiere. Ein Wal! Ein Oktopus! Lust auf eine Schlittenfahrt? Spaß, die Kamelie ist wieder da. Mit 4 entzückenden Plüschtieren. Kommt mit, gemeinsam auf
Shakespeare von Regisseurin Chloe Zhao.
Wozu hast du denn Lust, Hamlet? Ich wäre gern Theater. Mit deinem Vater.
Eine Liebesgeschichte. Wirst du tapfer sein?
Ja.
Wirst du tapfer sein?
Ja.
Die Shakespeares größtes Meisterwerk inspiriert.
Ah, ist der da?
Hamlet ist ein monumentales Kinoerlebnis. Zärtlich und kraftvoll. Hamlet. Ab 22. Jänner. Nur im Kino.
Ich hab's so
Over the
gern.
next 26 years,
Wann bin ich
this
vorbeigegangen?
pursuit became an obsession, as did a more specialized type
Bin
of
ich
diving.
vorbeigegangen?
The first time Shek entered an underwater cave, it was like love at first sight.
Ah, das meinst du.
At the time,
Ja, stimmt.
their new activity, cave diving, was without a whole lot of training or safety standards. So from then on as well, Shek became one of the foremost experts in the community. So much so that he literally wrote the book on cave diving. In 1979, he published his book, Basic Cave Diving, A Blueprint for Survival, which is still considered the how-to manual for the sport. The book focuses primarily on safety and emergency, but beyond the book, he also became one of the most practiced, maybe even the most practiced cave divers ever.
Oh,
By
Brezeltimer.
23, he had already logged more than 100 cave dives, and that number exploded to more than 4,000 by his mid-40s. But as much as Shek loved adding to that total, it was extreme depth that brought out the ultimate competitor in him. And luckily for him, he seemed to have some rather unique abilities to withstand depth. The deeper a diver goes, the more risk grows. For starters, there is the crushing pressure of water at depth. As a diver descends, the weight of the water above increases. Go deep enough and the pressure of the water will squeeze anything not built to withstand those forces like an empty water bottle. The dangers aren't just external though. Internally, depth has a variety of impacts on the human body. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you've likely heard this explanation many times before, but bear with me because it's relevant to Shek's insane abilities. Conditions like nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness, or the bends, can set in fast and with little warning. However, nitrogen in the bloodstream can build up too fast for the body to keep up with absorbing it. This then has a narcotic effect on the body and can cause a person to feel intoxicated, hence the name nitrogen narcosis. It's often described as similar to being drunk, with a lot of the same impairments. Severe nitrogen narcosis, though, can bring on hallucinations, dizziness, and unconsciousness, all of which are obviously extremely hazardous hundreds of feet in water. To combat this, divers will use different gas mixtures the deeper they go, with less nitrogen than regular air. Weirdly, though, Shek seems to be almost immune to narcosis. While serving as a member of the support team for two divers trying to break the air-only depth record in 1970, Shek made it to 465 feet, or 142 meters, before he experienced any effects of narcosis. Sadly, the two divers he was assisting did not share that same resistance to narcosis and died during the attempt. Shek was also the first person to ever dive below 800 feet, or 240 meters, in technical scuba diving, which is a feat that has 20 people in history at 21. And on top of his near immunity to narcosis, Shek never once experienced a case of decompression sickness. Decompression sickness, or the bends, occurs when all that nitrogen that was absorbed as soft tissue on descent floods its way back into the bloodstream too quickly and creates bubbles. Most cases of the bends are not serious, but it can cause death if it's severe enough. The best way to avoid this is by making something known as a decompression stop during the ascent. The number and duration of these stops is determined by how deep a diver goes and how long they stay at that depth, since these variables determine how much nitrogen gets absorbed by the body. By stopping at specific depths and remaining there for a set amount of time, the nitrogen is released slowly and doesn't form large bubbles that can be a problem. As you might imagine, any diver with a resistance to these conditions has a serious advantage, so by 1994, Shek had all three of the deepest dives of all time. A few years prior, Shek had even broken his own record by diving 881 feet, or 269 meters. But he knew he could go further still. He just needed somewhere to do it. It was around this time when his good friend and diving partner, Jim Bowden, told him about a place he believed had the deepest known sinkhole in the world. The cave that Jim was talking about is called Zakatone, and it's technically not a cave at all. It's a sinkhole called a cenote, which is a cousin of the blue hole. Both blue holes and cenotes are created as bedrock erodes and collapses over time to expose groundwater. The only difference between the two is that blue holes are located near the ocean and cenotes are found inland. They're often referred to as caves, since that's what they were before their ceilings fell in.
Meine Freunde sagen immer, mein Zuhause sieht so stylisch aus, aber die Lampen wurden nicht. Und dann habe ich Niona entdeckt. Ein deutsches Label, das Designerleuchten macht, aber eben ohne diese übertriebenen Preise von 700 bis 800 Euro. Diese hier war sofort mein Favorit. Schwebendes Design, warmes Licht, dimmbar, super cozy und endlich nicht dieses grelle, ungemütliche Licht, das den ganzen Raum zerstört. Seit sie hängt, fühlt sich unser Essbereich komplett anders an. Viel harmonischer, viel wärmer, richtig wohnlich. Und weil Neona 3 Jahre Garantie gibt und alles super hochwertig verarbeitet ist, kann ich sie auch guten Gewissens weiterempfehlen.
Woher kommt die Bewegung? Sie können in Echtzeit nachvollziehen, warum sich Aktien oder Kryptos bewegen. Mit der Funktion Woher kommt diese Bewegung von eToro. Treffen Sie klügere Anlageentscheidungen mit eToro. Jetzt anmelden.
When Shaq saw Zakatone for himself in 1993, his enthusiasm exploded. The otherwise stoic and mild-mannered math teacher was like a kid the moment he resurfaced from his first dive there. Almost right away, Shaq and Jim began planning and preparing for a dive that would take them to 1,000 feet or 305 meters and beyond. They spent the next year discussing and examining every single little detail. Calculations had to be made to determine the type, blend, and the amount of gas the dive would require. Practice dive after practice dive would also need to be done to ensure both men were not only physically but mentally prepared to operate safely at 1,000 feet or more. The result of their work was a solid and specific plan. They got their support team set with divers Ann Kristovich and Marcus Gary, joining Shaq's wife Mary Ellen and Jim's wife Karen. They wouldn't enter directly through Zakatone since it was surrounded by tall rock faces on all sides. Instead, they would enter from the nearby spring and then swim through a 600-foot tunnel that connects the two. Before the dive, 2 weighted guide ropes were set up in the snow tank that both men would use to descend and ascend. When they were ready, Jim would descend first and Shaq would follow him after 10 seconds. They would be dropping fairly quickly. Unlike ascending, the descent could be executed as quickly as a diver chooses, so they planned to drop to the bottom at a rate of 100 feet or 33 meters per minute. This meant the entire trip would take about 10 to 12 minutes. Such a fast descent would help reduce the amount of decompression time they needed on the way up, since Shaq planned to just touch the bottom and then immediately begin ascending. This is because at the depth they were aiming for, spending even 1 minute there translated to hours of additional decompression stops. During the descent as well, they'd need to switch tanks and regulators on the fly once they reached specific depths. Incredibly, they planned to use 6 different mixtures of nitrogen, oxygen, and helium across over 30 tanks. To avoid narcosis and make decompression as fast as possible, this needed to be precise. But since no one had ever been to 1,000 feet or beyond, it was uncharted territory. Because of this, Shaq worked with a physiologist to dial in the proper gas mixtures. And even though the plan called for Shaq to begin ascent immediately the moment he touched bottom, and with tanks staggered along their guide ropes with gas mixtures intended to shorten decompression stops, the return trip would still take about 10 to 50 stops to complete. While they ascended, members of the support team would descend to specific depths to wait for Shaq and Jim and assist as needed. Finally, after everything was planned to perfection, they set a dive date of April 6, 1994, just 6 days after Shaq's 45th birthday. This was also when Shaq would be on spring break from teaching. But throughout the year of planning, despite the incredible physical shape he was in, Shaq spent a lot of time thinking about his future in diving. He was another year older, and the invincibility of his 20s and 30s was fading, which was something he found out abruptly. While diving a freshwater sinkhole in South Africa called Bushman's Hole in 1993, Shaq had the first real underwater scare of his career. He was attempting to reach 863 feet, or 263 meters, when the helium in his tanks started to turn on him. This is because divers at extreme depths are at risk of another condition. In addition to nitrogen narcosis, they also have to worry about a condition called high-pressure nervous syndrome, or HPNS. Like narcosis and decompression sickness, HPNS is reversible. It comes on suddenly with potentially debilitating symptoms. It can set in anywhere below 500 feet or 150 meters while breathing helium. The effects are also highly individual and based on variables like how much helium is in a diver's mix, how deep they dive, and the rate of descent. During the 1960s, HPNS was first documented by a U.S. Navy physiologist who called the effects helium tremors since violent shaking is one of the most common symptoms. HPNS can also cause extreme sleepiness, changes in heart rate and rhythm, and decreased mental functioning. Shaq's descent into Bushman's Hole was also performed at a rate of 100 feet per minute, and Shaq began to tremble around 700 feet. Then his vision turned into countless tiny circles, each with black dots in the center, and his skin became intensely itchy before transitioning to a stinging feeling. With all of that going on, he continued his descent to 863 feet, at which point too bad to continue. He managed to begin his ascent and stopped at 750 feet to allow his body to adjust, but it was no use. The only thing that would reverse his HPNS was to keep him tired. Finally, he was able to get the symptoms to stop, but the experience scared him. Even before then, he never viewed himself as immortal, and he was well aware of the potential dangers that exist deep underwater. But those moments in bush patrol caused Shek to start questioning whether it was time to step away from the extreme depth record chasing. It was something he had thought about constantly since then, and when he came to a decision, he announced to the diving community that his upcoming dive at Zakaton would be his last extreme depth dive. Crossing the 1,000-foot or 305-meter threshold was the perfect note to go out on. When April 6 arrived, Shek, Jim, and the support team made the drive to Zakaton to make their final preparations. After learning about Shek's world record attempt and that it would be his last extreme dive, several sports publications and a small TV news channel were on the scene to report his attempt. When everything was ready to go, Shek and Jim entered the water and moved through the tunnel that connected the spring to the sinkhole. As they surfaced inside Zakaton, they couldn't help but notice the growing crowd of farmers and locals on the surrounding cliffs. There's not a whole lot to see during a cave dive for those on land, but people who live nearby weren't going to miss a world record attempt anyway. Shek and Jim were appreciative of the interest, but didn't let the presence of the crowd distract them. As they bobbed up and down the surface, both of them closed their eyes and started to meditate. They played the entire dive out in their mind's eye, where they slowed their breathing to just a few breaths per minute. Then, as if they could sense each other's readiness, they opened their eyes at the same time, and Shek nodded to his partner. At 9:45 a.m. that morning, Jim disappeared under the water with Shek right behind him. On the descent, they were on compressed air to 300 feet or 91 meters. At that point, they switched to a gas called heli-air, a term Shek coined, which is just helium mixed with regular air. At 600 feet or 180 meters, they switched again, this time to prime air, which is a combination of nitrogen, oxygen, and helium. If you're wondering how they were able to switch back and forth between so many gas tanks, because they were strapped with 200 pounds of gas tanks, which also conveniently helped their rapid descent. When Jim started to slow his descent at the 750-foot mark, this is when the first problem began. Jim began involuntarily trembling. He didn't know it at the time, but his rate of descent was much faster than planned, which meant he'd been breathing too much helium far deeper than he should have. As the trembling grew, Jim had no doubt that HPNS was setting in, and it was only going to get worse the deeper he went. But then when he looked over towards Shek's rope, Jim saw Shek's light descending past him toward the bottom. This meant that he had to keep descending. Then at 900 feet, or 274 meters, Jim checked his air gauges and was stunned by how much trimix he had already consumed. There's always some variance with gas calculations, but they usually aren't big enough to impact the dive or the diver. This was a pretty big discrepancy though. With one tank of trimix already finished, the second tank was only showing 1,000 psi, meaning he was already about 2/3 of the way through his supply. But even worse, if the pressure dropped below 500 psi, gas would stop flowing through his regulator. He needed to ascend right away. So, at 925 feet, Jim inflated his buoyancy device to a BCD. Jim's wrist computer then set his first decompression stop at 450 feet. By the time he reached that mark, the last of his mix was gone, and so was his heli-air supply. Fortunately, there was no decompression gas waiting there for him. As if things couldn't get any worse, when he opened the valve on that tank, gas shot through the regulator, causing it to fly out of its mouth. Thinking quickly, he switched the regulator connected to the compressed air tanks on his back, while he tried to fix the regulator as it flailed in the water from the force of the gas leaving the tank. After messing with it for a while, he just couldn't get the regulator fixed, so he was left with only one option. He had to put the tank under his arm and continue to ascend as he opened and closed the valve when he needed to breathe. It was an agonizing process in an already challenging environment, and making matters worse was that Jim would need to make several decompression stops before he reached the next tank at 300 feet. When he finally got there, he ditched the tank with the faulty regulator for a new tank with one that worked. Finally, he was able to breathe a sigh of relief and turned his attention back towards Shek.
Alles muss ich ja selber machen. Ich finde einfach keine passenden Mitarbeitenden. Aber das hält fit. Absicht. Auch Absicht.
Indeed. Statt Ausreden, jetzt die richtigen Mitarbeitenden finden und 75 € Startguthaben sichern. Mit Indeed hast du es im Griff.
On the surface, the sport took a close eye on the bubbles rising from the water. About 2 minutes after Shek and Jim went under, the bubbles disappeared, which indicated they were beyond a ledge that jutted out at around 250 feet. Based on the plan and the extensive calculations done, once the bubbles stopped rising to the surface, they should reappear within 12 to 18 minutes. And right on time, one set of bubbles broke the surface above Jim's rope, but not Shek's. Knowing that Shek would be diving deeper than Jim, the team expected to see Jim's bubbles first, and then a delay before bubbles would reappear above Shek's rope. As time ticked by, without any sign of Shek, the team grew concerned. One of the support divers went back to the ground tank and began to make their way through the tunnel to meet up with Jim and find out what was going on. Back in the water on Jim's journey from 250 feet to 170, he looked over at Shek's rope and expected to see it taut and moving, but it was just slack and still. He looked down and saw nothing but blackness. There were no lights and no bubbles. Realizing what this might mean, he had a brief moment of panic, but he managed to convince himself that Shek was just further behind than expected. When he reached his next decompression stop, though, he saw Anne was waiting there for him, and he could sense her worry. While they waited together for Jim's decompression stop to end, they fixed their eyes on Shek's rope, just hoping to see any sign of life. On the cliffs surrounding the sinkhole, Shek's wife, Mary Ellen, hadn't realized anything was out of the ordinary until she noticed the others were gone. Then she walked to the spring, where she found Jim's wife, Karen, and the other support diver, Marcus, looking distraught. Karen then approached Mary Ellen and gave her the news that Shek might be in trouble, but she was barely finished the sentence before Mary Ellen was in the water and on her way through the tunnel. When she made it to Anne and Jim, she scrawled a message on her whiteboard telling them that she was going to go look for Shek at 250 feet. She then reached the ledge at that depth and expected to see Shek's light at the very least by that point, but there was nothing but the same blackness below her that Jim saw. She dropped off the ledge and descended a bit further. Without the right gas to continue, she had to turn around. After Mary Ellen entered the water, Karen followed behind her and remained at 100 feet to meet her. When Mary Ellen got back up to her, Karen could see that she was in tears. Mary Ellen tried to continue ascending, but Karen grabbed her wrist to see how far she descended while trying to find Shek. She saw that Mary Ellen had to decompress for 30 minutes before it was safe to surface. Karen then held Mary Ellen in her arms, and it remained like that for the entire stop. On the banks of the spring, one of the photographers noticed bubbles rising in the water and lifted his camera to his face. As he shot photos of Karen and Mary Ellen surfacing and exiting the water, he noticed that they were both sobbing when they pulled their masks off. He then put his camera back down as Mary Ellen let out a scream of pure grief that would haunt anyone who heard it. Long after the others had returned to the surface, Jim was still in the midst of a decompression process that still had hours remaining. During this, one of the support team divers met Jim at his decompression stop around 60 and confirmed which Shek was out. That
Dan
confirmation
Engels.
held on to the stern heart that Shek was behind schedule.
Bis nachher gleich.
With that confirmation,
Bitte?
Jim
Ja, Frank.
wanted to be anywhere other than being suspended at decreasing depth for hours, but going to the surface before his decompression stops were complete was dangerous. He had no choice but to remain underwater with his own thoughts for as long as it would take. Finally, after almost 10 hours, Jim emerged from the water alone. The shock among everyone surrounding Zakatone became almost tangible as word spread. It was a scenario that was always a possibility, but no one really thought there would be a dive that Shek wouldn't return from. For a few days, no one even really knew what to do, but eventually the support teams and locals had to return to Zakatone to retrieve the equipment. When one of the team went to pull Shek's rope up, it was too heavy since there were still unused bottles tied to it for Shek's ascent. So as a team, they worked to pull up more than 1,000 feet of rope with a considerable amount of weight tied to it. Then, as it broke the surface, they realized that at the end of it was Shek's body. What exactly happened to Shek that day will never fully be known, but there are a couple of theories. Maybe the most likely is that Shek had another HPNS event. The physiologist who assisted Shek theorized that he likely didn't die as a direct result of HPNS, but if the tremors were violent enough, it's possible that he lost his regulator and drowned. Another possibility is that despite Shek's thoroughness, the gas mixtures could have just been wrong. Too much nitrogen can cause narcosis, too much helium can fry the nervous system, and too much oxygen at too deep a depth can become toxic. The consequences are just as dire if any of the gases are too low as well. If anything was far off enough, it could have caused any number of conditions with potential to incapacitate him. How Shek became tangled in the rope wasn't clear either, but the way that he was attached to it looked far more intentional than accidental. There's some speculation that Shek knew he was going to die and that he tied the rope to himself so his body could be recovered without putting anyone else in danger. A week after being retrieved from Zakatone, Shek was celebrated by his family, friends, and the entire diving community that was grateful for the work he did to make their shared passion safer. He was then buried next to his brother Edward in Jacksonville, Florida. In a cruel twist given the circumstances, when Jim left the water on that fateful day, he did so as the new world record holder, steepest dive on a self-contained breathing apparatus, beating the record Shekels set and was attempting to break when he died. Today, only 5 people on Earth have ever been to 1,000 feet underwater, but none would have accomplished the feat if not for Shek and his contributions to cave diving. The current depth record is 1,090 feet, or 332 meters, set in 2014.
Stupid. Could be
Hello
more.
everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. And once again, a huge thank you to Babel for sponsoring this video. Make sure to check them out using the link in the description for 60% off a subscription. And hopefully, I will see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories featuring caves that are incredibly unique compared to the others covered on the channel. And because of these unique features, they probably never should have been entered at all, as the people in the stories found out. As always, viewer discretion is advised. About 12 million years ago, an underwater volcano formed in the Atlantic Ocean that produced many eruptions over the course of 9 million years. And with the help of tectonic plate movement, the island of Tenerife, as we know it today, was created. Tenerife is the largest of the Canary Islands and sits about 300 miles or 480 kilometers off the western coast of Africa. The Canaries are a chain of islands that are Spanish territory, and Tenerife is the most populated among them, with nearly 1 million people calling it home today. In terms of annual visitation, however, Tenerife sees 5 times that as one of Spain's most popular and important vacation destinations. Most tourists come for the beautiful beaches, but the landscape of the island is incredibly diverse for a landmass of just 785 square miles.
Måste det gå.
Central Tenerife is home to dense pine forests, while closer to the coast
Tja.
you can find steep rocky dunes, beaches, and of course, caves. Unlike some of the places featured on the channel to this point, tourists don't feel an irresistible draw to the island's caves. Instead, the complex underground systems on the island are more of a hidden gem reserved for those with an adventurous side. Scientists take great interest in the caves of Tenerife too. That's because many of the island's caves aren't caves in the traditional sense. Instead, they're actually lava tubes. When a volcano erupts, lava travels outward through self-made channels, and when particularly thick and slow-moving lava seeps out of the earth, it remains extremely hot in the channels while the area around the lava actually cools. This causes a hard crust to form on top of even the most active lava streams. As the molten hot liquid rock flows over a long enough time, it creates tunnels that remain long after an eruption ceases and the lava recedes. Tenerife just so happens to have a lot of lava tubes, also known as galleries, including Cueva del Viento. This particular one holds the title of the largest volcanic tunnel in Europe at 11 miles or 18 kilometers long, and systems of lava tubes can be found all over the island, and many of them connect to one another. On Saturday, February 10th, 2007, a group of nearly 30 people gathered on the western side of the island for a hike that would take them through one of these lava tubes. The expedition was planned and organized by the Tenerife Association of Friends of Nature, and normally the outings attracted small groups, which were usually full of familiar faces. But on February 10th, a larger than average crowd showed up, including a handful of scholarship recipients of the Canary Astrophysics Institute. Together, the group set off and began enjoying the picturesque landscapes of Tenerife's peaks and ravines on a gorgeous day. At around 2 o'clock, they reached the base of a mountain that they need to get to the other side of, and there were only 2 ways that could happen, either over or through. Since this was more of a leisurely hike, the latter was the better option as a lava tube connected the 2 ravines. So, in a single file line, everyone began entering the tube and crouching under the low ceiling while shuffling through ankle-deep water. What none of them realized at the time, however, was that they had chosen the wrong tube, because while the hike was organized by an official nature club, there were no experienced guides leading the group. Instead, one of the club's officials received directions and instructions on his phone from someone who knew the path well. The group was essentially being led into a potentially dangerous lava tube via just a few notes jotted down on the phone. So when the trail led to a gallery opening, they figured that it must be the one they were looking for, so they continued inside. Had they walked just a little further, they would have found the correct tube nearby, but since none of the tubes had any signs outside, it was impossible for them to know that with the information they had available at the time. The group advanced further and further inside the lava tube, and by 3 o'clock they were a little over a mile beneath the mountain, and everyone began feeling a little strange. Before anyone could put their finger on exactly what that was, one of them fainted and fell to the cave floor. Then another hiker fainted, and another, until 16 of 29 lost consciousness. The other 13, closer to the back of the pack, were feeling the same effects of whatever caused the others to pass out, but they managed to turn around to escape the tube. Sometime later, at around 4:45 p.m., a call was placed to emergency services by those who made it out, and members of federal rescue services rushed to the scene. Still inside by that point were 16 hikers who lost consciousness, but before rescuers entered the tube, an important briefing took place between them and those who made it out. All of them reported the smell of some kind of gas around the time the others lost consciousness, so rescuers would have to be careful not to end up in a similar state as those trapped inside. Beyond that, though, the effort to get all 16 to safety was not going to be an easy one. The tube the group mistakenly entered was at its largest about 6 feet wide and 6 feet high, or 2 by 2 meters, but most of it was even tighter than that. Thankfully, as rescuers made their way inside, some of those 16 who passed out regained consciousness and were able to make it out of the cave under their own power. As they continued on, somewhere around 5,000 feet or 1,400 meters, rescuers found the first of those who hadn't woken back up yet and began the process of removing them. Then, just beyond that, they began to notice the smell of gas that had been reported by those who escaped before passing out. Throughout the night and into the morning hours of February 11th, rescue workers needed to proceed with an extreme amount of caution. As they located and extracted hikers,
Grimberg.
became known. 8 of the ones that were rescued that were unconscious were airlifted to a hospital with issues that varied in severity. Most of them had acute breathing issues, but 2 were in more serious condition, showing signs of muscular injuries from the awkward position they passed out in. As the afternoon of February 11th approached, only 6 of the original 29 hikers remained inside, but rescuers were concerned about their conditions. The 6 hikers had been leading the group, so they were the furthest inside the cave. And as rescuers advanced toward them, the smell of gas inside became stronger and stronger, suggesting that higher concentrations of it were lingering the deeper you went into the tube. Finally, about 20 hours after the hikers began what they hoped would be a fun, leisurely exploration, the rescue effort took a tragic turn as the last 6 were discovered dead. All of them had died from oxygen deprivation. The amount of time the brain can go without sufficient oxygen is so scarce that they were likely dead long before the first part of the group escaped. It takes just 1 minute of oxygen starvation for the brain cells to begin dying, and 4 minutes later, death is just about inevitable. In the aftermath of the disaster, those who were intimately familiar with the lava tubes in the area said the hikers were in just about the worst place they possibly could have been. Tenerife is an active volcano island, and just because it hasn't erupted since the start of the 20th century doesn't mean that there isn't a lot going on underground. As rock melts under the indescribable heat inside a volcano, it produces gases that travel through the network of lava tubes. Volcanic gas is denser than air, so as it builds up and becomes more concentrated, it replaces the breathable air. Just as those who survive reported, by the time you realize you're in a dangerous area that might not have enough oxygen, it's almost too late. Fatigue sets in and rapidly advances, and once you notice it, you only have moments to reverse it by getting out of the affected area. 3 days of mourning was declared by local governments after these 6 dead hikers were discovered and extracted from the cave. It was getting late in the evening on August 15, 1992, as friends Dave, Scott, and Alex, dressed in scuba gear, descended beneath the waters of Mickjack Lake in Tennessee. And there was a good reason why they were diving under the cover of darkness. Their plan was to enter Mickjack Cave, which was forbidden by the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, due to the cave being home to an endangered species of bat. Outside the cave, a heavy chain-link fence protected the entrance, but that didn't stop Dave and his friends. Underwater, there was a gap between the fence and the bottom of the lake, so all they had to do was swim under it. This would actually be their 3rd time in the cave as well, with their 2nd coming only the night before. And funny enough, the reason for their dive was fish. Dave and his friends were after catfish, and those inside the cave were said to be of mythical proportions, maybe even as much as 200 pounds or 91 kilograms. During the dive the night before, Dave spotted one of the monsters and got a shot off from a spear gun, but only managed to graze the fish. Throughout the day on August 15th, he just couldn't get it off his mind. The fish was too big to just let it go, so this night was all about redemption. Now, in a strange way, the cave was kind of a place of second chances. Just prior to the completion of a hydroelectric dam operated by the TVA in 1967, the cave was actually dry, and one day that year, a man dressed in all black made his way inside and sat down. At the time, he viewed himself as a hopeless addict whose marriage was crumbling as a result of his habits. Inside the cave, he planned to end this. Before he went through with it, he sat deep in thought for a few hours. As he did, he had a spiritual experience that completely and instantly changed his outlook. He had come all this way to end it all, but he thought his place in life and world. So instead of the cave being a setting for the end, it was a new beginning for, if you can believe it, none other than Johnny Cash. As incredible as that is, though, the cave has a much deeper history that goes back to the Chickamauga tribe, which used it as a base of sorts for war dances and to scheme up ways to fight off settlers. Then, during the Civil War, the cave was a vital resource for the Confederacy, as its high concentration of saltpeter was crucial for the production of gunpowder. Over the years that followed, there were failed attempts to commercialize it, with the main attraction being a stalagmite believed to be the largest in the world. Finally, with the completion of the dam and the Indiana bat being named a protected species in the same year, the flooding of the cave marked the end of illegal exploration. As Dave Scott